Welcome to the Nonprofit Exchange Podcast. Stories by leaders for leaders to help you raise the bar on your own excellence, to release the potential inside of you. Now, here's today's podcast. Hey, folks, this is the Nonprofit Exchange, and Russell and Hugh are back. And as usual, we have a really good guest today with some secrets of how to install good, sound business principles into the nonprofit organization that you lead. Russ, how you doing today?
It's another fine day here in Colorado, a little bit chilly, but I've got my great colleague here, a man with a warm heart, Steve Merager. He's here to share with us how you can put your nonprofit on track for success by having the right systems. Works with business leaders all over the area. And I was pleased to be able to find some time in his schedule for him to come join us. So I'm looking forward to talking with him so he can tell us a little bit about how you can make your systems more effective.
What I know is if Russell brings somebody to the table, they're very confident. So Steve, welcome, and tell people a little bit about yourself and why you're doing what you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. So I have 30 years of experience with in all areas of finance. That includes everything from working with universities to being a consultant, international consultant. I have worked in finance for most of that time, as well as IT. And really what happened was about 4 years ago, I decided that that I needed to give more, that I had a lot to give to outside of a corporation. And so I quit the lucrative job, and I decided to help smaller businesses, independent businesses. And really, I leverage all of the work that I did, including being a budget lead for a $9 billion bond project and heading up the federal direct loan program implementation in the first year. Using that type of skill and also in the for-profit world, and really taking best practices that are available to every organization, really, and let small and medium-sized businesses and organizations, not-for-profits, really leverage what I can do with my business. And so these last 4 years have been thrilling. I've done all kinds of work, which is just, everything from going into, with not-for-profits. One of the things I did was one board asked me to go in and, audit their books, see what had happened in the last year or so. And, it was really, it was really good for that organization to get that type of information from a non-biased third party that could really provide a deep report back to them as to what had happened. And so I've also been the treasurer for several not-for-profits, and there's a lot of just really best practices. Not-for-profits, it's a different type of world where, as I think it should be in all organizations, that the volunteers and all the people outside of the organization, they're just so important, so critical, and it's so important to keep those individuals happy. And again, which it really should be done everywhere. The people doing the work are just critical to make any organization run. So yeah, so that's where I am, and it's such a thrill to help organizations, get to that next level, whatever that is that they need. And, setting up an internal organization, the great thing about it is it can be sustainable, long-term sustainable, and people are happy working within that financial organization. And so I think that's one of the key pieces as well.
Great. Thank you for being here. Russell has spent some time with you, and he's formulated some good questions. So let's let him get us started with those really good questions.
Oh, thanks, Hugh. Yeah, Steve, we talk a lot about relationships and getting out there and working with so many different audiences that a nonprofit has. But what are some critical questions that the internal team need to ask themselves to be effective?
Well, first of all, one of my first priorities is always to make sure that any decisions that is made has been fully documented. And what that means is that's the end point. What that means is that there is a clear definition of how decisions are made. Sometimes that can be delegated to a treasurer, but it starts with a board, and they're the ones with the overall fiduciary duty, the first fiduciary duty. So it really starts with that. It starts with procedures to make sure that that the same thing is done, that there's consistency. With every organization that I've helped, I've given assurances that the organization would be bulletproof, with an audit. That to me is just incredibly critical, and it's a good measurement to ensure that the things are being done correctly. There's also within organizations, political, how people are working with each other. What are the are there any roadblocks? Any roadblocks to to decisions being made? There's also a budget is a critical piece, and that is a really important planning tool that can be used. And so, and we can perhaps we can get into that a little bit later. But that's one thing where it's a budget being a living document. It's reviewed, say, every month, maybe every quarter, but it provides a realistic way for the organization to see itself, where all of its resources are. Financial resources, right? So there's the volunteer leads, and those, of course, are the most important resources. But with almost every aspect of any organization, the money somehow comes into play. And we want to make sure that, really that it's almost transparent. That it's not a concern. It's just something that it's taken care of. It's there to serve the organization, and the money side of the organization gets out of the way of of the primary mission of the organization.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions in to ask. In order to be effective, nonprofits have to really connect with people outside of the organization. So who would you say are some of the most critical partners that a nonprofit organization would have, and why are these people important?
Right. So there are best practices, but that can become a complex thing. The complexities of how do we implement this best practice? What does it mean in this scenario? What is the context behind that best practice? So one of the best resources really is other not-for-profit treasurers or CFOs, whoever the financial person is. Really get a high-end discussion going of what's going on, and really get some information, some opinions about how they think it could be handled. Another one is the organization's CPA, the individual that does the taxes at the end of the year, typically. That person, so the CPAs, the tax individuals, they're not necessarily operations people, but they can provide some information, especially, I've had to, push back at times when a board was considering something because, the organization needs to know if it's risky or if we shouldn't be doing it, or if there's a better way to do it. The intent of most boards is good, and we just want to make sure that that's done correctly. Sometimes, we can reach out to the IRS. That's one of those where, kind of take it with a grain of salt, but they can be helpful. we also, there are things that we could do possibly too. It sounds kind of funny, but vendors can help us as well. They can structure their billing in a different way. They can, there's several ways that they can help us out. And there's also donors or representative from donors or from the community. Somebody that is very tied into to the community of donors or volunteers or whatever it might be. They can really provide some additional information about what's going on outside of the organization that can free up, that can make decisions easier internally and also more palatable for for the constituents once they are put out there. I mean, it's arguably one of the difficult ways to lead is to sort of lead from from on top. You got to get buy-in from people, and so a good way to do that is to talk with them first and see what they think about that. And there's also people within the organization itself, and so they don't have to be outside the organization to have incredibly valuable input.
One of the benefits that people get from talking with you is they really kind of find out whether their organization is healthy or not. And in a nonprofit, you've got all of these leadership roles. You've got board members. What are some of the things that the board should focus on as far as goals for making sure the organization is healthy? And what do those key leaders on the board, what sort of things do they have to accomplish in order to make sure that the nonprofit's healthy?
Yeah, so it can take some introspection. Introspection can be helpful with that. Especially the lead person, the chair of the board, what's best for the organization? How can we make that happen? What lines of communication can we open? It's really a sensibility of going back and going back and going back and making sure that the things that have been implemented are continued to be correct, continue to focus the organization with the vision that has been put forth, that's been agreed to. And so, that can fall outside of the financial side of it. But again, the financials typically, they affect almost everything. So, a budget is a great way to, it's a great way to determine what the, what the priorities are for an organization. There's nothing like sitting down and having a discussion about, here are the resources and what are we going to do? And with a positive discussion, you can, since you have limited resources, it's then becomes obvious what things should be, should be funded. And that budgeting process can really focus. It can really take that vision that can be a lot of times, idealistic or, sort of amorphous, and it can really focus things down to, let's say I've worked with organizations, and there was a question about infrastructure. Should we spend 20% of our budget this year on infrastructure so we don't have to keep renting, items? And it focuses, well, so where are we? What kind of organization how do we see ourselves in 5 years? So some of those questions, and somebody that's really thoughtful, a financial leader, will ask these questions. Does this continue to make sense? There's a point with almost any organization where it sort of goes from that, think of, Apple, you go from that sort of garage mentality to, this is a real organization that's going to be, we're going to continue to offer these services. We're going to be in business for indefinitely. And that's really the point, that there's a critical point at which your organization sort of flips in a certain way, in a great way, to thinking, to knowing that they are just viable. They're continuously viable. And it's a beautiful thing to witness. And when you see that, when you see leadership saying, yes, we should do that, because that's how we need, that's going to affect us, this organization 20 years from now. And yeah, so the budget is certainly a key part of that.
Okay. So there are a lot of critical players within the organization, and you really painted a great picture overall, but could you talk about some of those people who are critical in these pieces of the decision making and in making sure that that the organization stays on track, some of the specific people that are very critical to that process?
Right. Well, so it all starts with the board, and a healthy board is really one that it's concerned about policy. So it's setting policy, and it is providing the resources and delegating the responsibility to the leads within the organization to implement those policies. And that's a really critical piece of it. So, within the organization, there can be any number of things, and it depends on how well funded it could be. If it's staff helping out, maybe volunteers. That's always a great place to be, but it can have limitations. If you have, say, a person that is a bookkeeper, so you want a bookkeeper, you probably want if possible, a budget lead. Sometimes an assistant treasurer, somebody that is doing some of the more short-term oversight, maybe doing the monthly budget, maybe seeing where that all ties together, doing things like allowing people to have debit cards so that they can be empowered to go out and buy things, whoever needs to. Getting the financial side out of the way of the organization doing the things. There's also something that I have advocated typically with most organizations, and that's a finance committee. And in the simplest way, it's bringing together the people that have different, speak, different ways of looking at the organization. In the simplest way, that would be, let's say, well, certainly the treasurer, because that's the person that is inside the financials, but also somebody from the board. So they have an independent idea of the board might, the board is sort of thinking about doing maybe some of those things I talked about before. And then perhaps somebody from the community, some other constituency. So you have sort of, these different needs being expressed by people in the same room. And one of the beautiful things about a finance committee is that the budget lead can go through the budget process, talk to all the leads, get all of that together. And then the first discussion really can be with the finance committee, and the finance committee can go through and typically the way I structure it is that the finance committee will sort of green light. And the way we do budgets, the way I advocate doing budgets, is by line item. So it's literally not a dollar amount, but literally what will you specifically need. And so, maybe there's a music festival and they need to build a stage. So they need, 50 sheets of plywood. So they're going to literally put 50 sheets of plywood and the dollar amount for each piece. And then that's going to come up with a dollar amount. So the finance committee is going to take each one of those line items, hundreds of line items sometimes, and green light as many as they can. And also, yellow flag some of them as, this is okay, but the board should maybe look at this. And then red flag those that are really questionable, that they absolutely are, they're recommending. So all these are recommendations to the board. And so then what it does is it shortens the lifespan and simplifies the budgeting process, because the board then gets the budget, and they can go through and say yes, all the green flag, that yeah, yes, and then a really good discussion about that. So that's the finance committee. And also one of the things which is really helpful, and especially with some maybe newer organizations, is that the finance committee actually gets a budget as well. And what that means is maybe 1-2% of the overall budget. It's a discretionary budget. And what that means is, let's say an organization has an event. That's one of their key things. It's coming up. There's so much happening, and somebody needs, another 50 pieces of plywood. Instead of going in front of the board, getting the board all together, the finance committee can come together and spend or allocate some of their budget to the department so they can get that. And so it doesn't slow things down. And so that's the finance committee. And then, you might want to have a committee for different events. An event, something that is a smaller piece of the entire organization. And so that's also a good group to look at. And then, as I think I mentioned, some of the past leadership.
Yeah, money is a very important thing for any organization, and you talk about having a finance committee to help with that. And what are some of the key questions that every organization should ask as they're building a financial structure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The first one is, how does it serve the mission of the organization? It should be light. It should be easily usable. It shouldn't slow things down unnecessarily. There's a balance point. You can have an organization, so you can look at it from both directions, both sides. You can have an organization where it's fast and loose, and hey, just buy what you need, get the receipts in. You have, $1,000 budget, go for it. We'll collect the receipts at the end. So that's great in the sense that things are going to get done immediately. It's not great because once people get something, whatever it is that they need, you're not going to get many of those receipts. You're not going to get all those receipts. My intention, as I said before, with any not-for-profit is to be bulletproof in an audit. And the perfect way to not be bulletproof is to let people spend money before you get the receipts. One of the things I did, just as an aside, which worked out really well with one organization, is a lot of people needed things from, let's say, Home Depot. So they would have a budget, and it's really tricky to give money out, to have access to money. So one of the things that we did was they set up a shopping cart with authentication. They'd fill the shopping cart, and I would go in and I would pay it, or have like the assistant treasurer pay it. And so that way we made sure that we had the receipts, that everything was all sewn up right there. So that's the side that, the fast and loose side. Give out the money. No, you're not going to be bulletproof. The other way to do it is to just lock things down and really make people jump through hoops, and it can slow down the process. And perhaps more importantly, it can make it such that volunteers get frustrated. And that can be especially difficult. You can lose volunteers easily by having a financial structure that is, it feels restrictive. It feels, maybe like they're not trusted, that type of thing. So there's really a good balance point with that. Transparency is certainly one of those that makes up a good system, that everybody knows really what's going on. That if there's questions, they can be easily answered. One of the things that I did, that I do typically, is I allow or set up, it's in QuickBooks, it's free access. You can give report access to anybody. It's unlimited. And if somebody has access to the reports of everything in the system, they know what's going on. They know that there's no sort of funny business. There's no questions. There's no question of impropriety. And that removing that any question of impropriety is just incredibly critical, so that there's trust. And whenever there's money involved, people rightly so, they want things to be correct. And so any opportunity to make that trust obvious and explicit is incredibly important. QuickBooks and I don't necessarily push QuickBooks, but it's a good option for most small businesses. But it'll do things like it'll automatically email reports to you up to every day if you want. And so setting up, your question being good things to do to set up an organization, making sure that there is an accounting system, and one that is robust, one that can grow with the organization. Something that is a critical question, a question point, is what accounting system do we want to implement? You can get cheap, and you're going to get cheap. It's going to be great until it's not great, and then transferring it over to some other accounting system is going to be, most of the time, to be honest with you, it's almost impossible. So you have to start over.
The first thing that I would do was go in and ask for corporate minutes, corporate books, stuff that the board put together. I'd ask for the policies, particularly the fiscal policies, because as an auditor, you want to, the first thing that you have to do is just get an idea of how things are framed. And is there a risk to how resources are handled here? You have to assess whether there's risk around it based on the policies. So can you speak a little bit to how that contributes to financial health of the organization?
Yeah, right. Absolutely. The policies are critical, and we talked about that a little bit earlier. And it's one of those things where you want consistency. As you know, as an auditor, an auditor comes in and, how did you do this? Well, I did it this way. And then, maybe they look at another disbursement. How did you do this? Well, we did it this way, which is not the same as the first way. And any auditor would say, whoa, what is happening here? Now you're going to need to show me all of your, just a ton more transactions. And then, really, if you're not doing something consistently, it's correct that they do that, because if you're not doing something consistently, something is going to break. That is, it's almost not possible to have the same result doing it multiple ways. So having those procedures signed off by the board, by the way, if possible, I would certainly recommend that they're signed off by the board, and they should be as detailed as possible. They should have information about the systems that are being used, maybe not down to the level of actual functionality, how a bookkeeper would open up a screen or something. So it's not speaking to that. It's speaking to how it's done in the larger sense, so that it can be tracked. And that's the thing. It's almost, if somebody can take the idea that if I am not around anymore, however that happens, and somebody looks at this transaction, they can see why we did it. And, it's business continuity. Get hit by a bus, right? The lead person gets hit by a bus, and it should not matter that person is no longer there. Their results should speak for themselves, and they should be obvious. And again, having procedure a written procedure is the clear way to do that.
There's some other reasons around that too, Steve. There's some accountability. I've heard stories about money disappearing. And so having some real good accounting that the person who requests the payment isn't the same person that approves the payment and isn't the same person that writes the check. But then I think there's an educational piece at educating board members about their fiduciary responsibilities as a board member. And so there's connectivity there as well, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Each one of those is critically important. And, depending on how that works out, the treasurer can see where the board is and provide input, provide some training. There's some critical things. You mentioned it, Hugh, absolutely correctly. You don't want somebody that's approving a payment to be dispersing the payment. That should never happen. So if that's happening in an organization, that is a huge red flag for any auditor, and it should be for the organization. There should be the separation of power, as you mentioned, Hugh, that nobody can both approve a payment and disperse it. So it's all of these things. It keeps the organization's funds, safe from misuse. Another thing, one thing that should be done with any organization as well is the finances should be audited, reviewed by somebody outside of the financial group every year. They should go through and they should look at really, best case, every transaction and see, look at every transaction and take a sampling within all of those transactions and see how they were done. I'm not speaking of a CPA audit. I'm speaking of this is being reviewed, independently from the financial team. So maybe somebody from, the board, and listen, it could be done. You could pay for it. It'll cost a few $1,000s to have a CPA do it, but that's also a good idea. And depending on the amount of money that an organization has made, it's a requirement. So, but there are cutoffs to that. To actually having what's called a review by a CPA and having an audit. So the review is the lesser overview, and the audit is really quite in depth. And
we do have a question from a viewer. He's in a different country. He's in California. Mark, and I think you probably answered a lot of this. What would be a procedure example? I think he would have been there a couple of minutes and I inserted this piece, but Mark, if you have another question, do they have to be on the ground in the office? Oh, he's in Peru. Sorry. He's in another country.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I thought I was being funny, but I thought I was wrong, but I was mistaken.
He's asking about the auditor, if that person needs to be on the ground or in the office.
So he's actually moved to Peru and is doing a charity there. So Mark can come back with your question again if we're not addressing it, but he's talking about the auditor. Do they have to be on the ground in the office? They're actually in Peru. And then, yeah, that's the auditor actually.
Well, okay. So most of the time now, organizations have digital records. And I certainly try to move all clients to digital records, whether it's Dropbox or maybe, Google Docs or, a Google Drive. You also have like QuickBooks Online that can be accessed from anywhere in the world. So therefore, if you have all of that, if everything is available, then it really doesn't matter where the person is. They don't have to come in. In fact, it can be better to have the arm's length review so that the person isn't in the office. I mean, listen, of course, if you have, if you have file cabinets and you're keeping paper, then somebody must come in and do that, and it's going to be much more expensive, by the way. But it's looking, again, it's looking at, and I see you want some examples. It's reviewing, let's say, an auditor will come in and they'll say, I want all the backup for these 10 disbursements. And however that is, whether it's digital or paper, they'll sit down and they'll look, and they'll also want the disbursement procedure. So they'll review what it was supposed to happen and what did happen, and they'll look at the disbursement and everything behind it. Take a look and see how it lines up with the procedure, and it'll get a pass, question mark, or a not pass. With all 10 of those, so they should pass. And Russ is nodding. I can see that. So all of them should have follow the same procedure. And if they don't, then the organization is asked for typically more disbursements, and then they'll review that, and then there might be a finding. So yeah, it doesn't have to happen in an office. It can happen, and typically happens these days, virtually.
Yeah, there was, as I finished up my days with the IRS, we were starting to move into the realm of requesting records electronically, because as you can imagine, the paper pile was insane. But what an auditor will typically do is they want to understand your electronic accounting system, and they will typically ask for a full backup of the system and the access to that, because they would be able to move around in the system and do different tests within that system and understand a little bit about how it works. As far as citing, when I was working with specific agencies, we took care of everything. Our accountants for one organization were right there in town. I did do some work for Child Development Services, which was a statewide agency. So they didn't have people on the ground locally. They would come up once a year, but we would share information electronically, and they would come in and look at the physical records once a year when they were doing the CPA audit. So it's really a question of how healthy you want to be. They look at things like your internal controls, which determines who handles money, who disperses it, what sort of authorizations you need. With purchases, typically an example of that would be for purchases that I made when I was working for the Micmac tribal government. I needed to complete a purchase order and submit it.
Yeah.
And then we'd have the disbursement. There's a paper trail there, and all of our transactions operated in that way, so that there was the paper trail and it went in electronically. Mm-hmm. But your auditors will look at your internal controls and your other policies, and that'll determine that level of risk and how many transactions that they have to look at to see if you're healthy. So it's that's generally sort of the layout.
Right. Yeah. And there are ways, I heard, Mark's, I saw Mark's question about examples. One of the things that an easy way to make sure that you get all the documentation is have each person send a singular email, depending on what the subject is, you can fish it out. But, they can attach a copy of their budget for the year, the receipts, and, sometimes, especially if there was a lot of things, or actually more than one thing, like a Google Doc that would, that would add together how much they've spent. And so really then you can just take that, and if it's all together, then for 100% that disbursement has been, has been spent correctly. And so there's some really easy ways to do it. A really tiny footprint as far as people needing to do things. Yeah, and I've worked with organizations where there was that sort of fast and loose way that I was talking about, where let's just exchange checks for receipts, and yeah, it'd be a little pushback, but after a while, people start to. My experience has been people start to appreciate that, because then they know that things are really being taken care of, and it's most people have access to email, most people have access to a smartphone. Just take a quick picture of the receipts and forward it, and it's relatively straightforward. So. Yeah.
Steve, another accountability thing that we stress at CenterVision is the integration of strategy and performance. So you write, and a lot of our organizations haven't spent the time to create a strategic plan, a roadmap for where they're going. But that way, the people part of it, we know what to do. So it's an engagement tool. The other part of it, it's a financial planning tool. You can't really effectively do a budget until you know what the milestones are, what they're going to cost. And then there's a spending plan, but there's also a fundraising plan. So talk a minute about that integration. If you spend $1, then you need to have a chart of accounts that says this is what it's paying for, and that needs to be on your strategy. So talk about that accountability piece.
Yeah, so that's certainly complex. It's really gets into deep oversight. Organizations have spending based on the administrative and other things, and yeah, making sure that that's integrated. And so not all organizations have donor outreach, but and it could be mixed. And so it's really it's long term. What does that look like? What is your needs of the organization? What are going to be the expenses going forward? One of the things when you have directed donations that you can only spend it on certain things, you have to make sure that within the accounting system that they're marked for that specific. Sometimes they're called projects within accounting systems, but for whatever that specific thing is, and the budgets can be created and the cash projections can be created such that that, well, okay, so listen, we're going to be really close here on this. We need to get some more donors in. Maybe we need to sell more tickets, whatever it might be. Maybe get a separate fundraising effort individually. So yes, those things can be broken out so that you can really be laser focused on, especially if the organization, this sounds like Hugh, where you're sort of thinking about if the organization has multiple needs, multiple strategies, multiple projects that are being done within a given year, that does need to absolutely be put together in a system such that those reports can come out. And that's, we talked earlier about having spreadsheets. That is precisely where a spreadsheet would be brutal. And I'm at least an expert with spreadsheets, and I would not want to. I wouldn't be very certain with a spreadsheet. To try to track something like that. Again, accounting system like QuickBooks, they have that, and it's that can be tracked, and the reports can be sent out to the board. Was that basically where you were?
Absolutely. Well, just think of a typical church. You've got a youth program that's got deliverables, it's got a track, they're doing certain projects, and they have a budget. And so there's a cap on what they can spend. And then the youth director makes a request to the treasurer approves it, somebody else signs the check, or the pastor approves it, the treasurer signs the check. So you've got that triad. The person requesting it doesn't mean there's somebody needs to approve this fits in the budget. Here's the line item. It fits in the integrity. And then somebody that's writing the check, it's no question. The money's there. We're going to write the check, or the line item's there. You got missions. You got the music ministry and all of its moving parts. So we've got these different programs that are under the single umbrella. And symphony orchestra, you got different concerts. Different kinds of organizations have these different projects they work on, and each one has a sub budget underneath the organization's budget. And we buy sheet music, we hire performers, we do publicity. So those are line items in your budget. but in the aggregate, we can't go above a certain amount. And then there's a responsibility to live within that. However, if we're doing it, is it in our plan? So there, to me, there's an integrity. We just don't spend money because we want to. We spend money because we're tied into what we said we're going to do organizationally in our plan. So that's kind of where I was headed with that.
Right. Yeah. And the ad hoc requests for things, I think should never happen. When you speak of, the orchestra, well, listen, I mean, if an orchestra, right, somebody needs a new instrument, something happened, of course, right? So there's certainly ad hoc things where something there needs to be, it needs to be flexible. The system needs to be flexible, but really, there should be, you talk about that orchestra. There should have been a discussion well before the fiscal year started, and that conductor, whoever's leading that, right, they should have asked each person how are your instruments? Do you have seats that are correct? Do you have the music stands? All the things. There should be complete awareness of everything that may be needed, and how it should be. My trombone has they're 5 years. Usage. And so there should be, you talk about long-term planning, that should be part of it. However much a trombone costs, you should go out 5 years and say, listen, we need to replace this. When you're doing that, so when you're going out that far, you can do things like what you should, set aside the money. So you have a, you're going to be depreciating these things, which is essentially setting them aside. So when that 5 years comes along, it's not oh no, we have to replace all the trombones or whatever it is. You can say, yeah, okay, that's great. That's in the plan. We knew that. That's part of what we're going to do. Go back to any other infrastructure. I've worked with some organizations where you have some really expensive equipment, and yes, they will need to be replaced. And so that part of the planning is part of it. It's full awareness of what's happening financially, and the risks. And each one of those are possibly a risk. Everything that is needed, that the organization has. I worked with an organization that, they stored everything between events in a trailer. And, that was a massive risk. We had to insure that trailer for everything that was inside of it. And there had to be some plan. Worst case scenario happens. Yes, there has to be a plan to make sure that the organization is, can continue on. Of course, there would be a lot of work to do to replace that level of loss, but still, there should be a plan with everything. It's good news, bad news. You have something, well, you have it. So now you either need to maintain it or replace it at some point. And so every one of those material items should have a sort of a plan behind it.
Well, that's part of your strategy. That would be a major maintenance accrual, like for a pipe organ or for painting or for a roof or an air conditioner. Those are, for a church, would be a major expenditure. And so if you got the life of an air conditioner's X number of years, 20 years, then you put away some and put it in some sort of interest-bearing account. Now, that's assuming we're not going hand to mouth and that we've got a successful financial plan in the first place, and that we've thought about the future, so that somebody like you on board. So what if you worked with a nonprofit? I mean, why would people need somebody like you as an outside presence? I've heard several. There's an outside accountability. There's tools that you bring. What are some other reasons somebody would need someone like a Steve to be part of their extended team?
Everybody needs a Steve. Should be my new tagline. Now, listen. So if an organization has been going for some amount of time, there's going to be inertia of how it's been done. Now, that can serve an organization really well, or it can cripple it. I think so much of life is about awareness outside of all the things we do in business. What are you aware of? I'll ask some questions that may have never been asked before in that organization.
Oh, yeah.
Why are you doing this? Why are you spending money for this? What is is this something, do you have a plan for this? Is this a fear that, the church is going to burn down, so you have to do whatever the things are, right? Why are we doing this? But, so it's not only that, but it's things like making sure that things are documented. It's going through and doing the budgeting. Some of these lead things that are happening. It's also oversight for for the bookkeeper. A bookkeeper they're brilliant people, and they're doing the critical work of the organization, and they may not be doing it they may not have access to what the strategy of the organization is. There may be a long-term vision of what the organization is doing, and the bookkeeper isn't in those meetings. That's not where they're thinking. Maybe, a lot of times bookkeepers, their specialty isn't strategy. It's not long-term thinking. It's not, there's a lot of these things. So it's that type of oversight, making sure that when the reports come out as well, that the leadership, they are getting a good review of it so that they know what they mean. The reports come out, and a lot of people, they look at all these numbers and their eyes cross. They think, oh my, what is this? And a good financial leader can say, yeah, this, and I like to say this too. This is that those financials are a story told in numbers, and every one of those numbers there's a human set of decisions and actions and all that behind it. There is some of the long-term planning. There is oversight to make sure that that regulations are being met. It's doing things like making sure that the financials are ready for tax time. It's doing things like making sure that some of the cumbersome things I've seen where things that have not been properly coded or kept in the books are just sort of, the can is kicked down the road year after year after year, and sometimes those things, the books need to be as clean as possible. There's things such as oversight of the whole system, because they're outside, as both of you clearly know, they're outside organizations that do a calculation of how efficient the organization was in spending money for the what the organization is chartered to do, and against how much they spent with administration. So raising the alarm to the board to say, listen, this is getting crazy. We're spending a lot of money. This is a massive risk out there. When our donors see this and we're spending whatever that dangerous place is, we may lose donations. So there's the bigger picture, the way that the organization is both in the world and internally, how it's being run inside. And it can also do things such as mentoring people that are doing roles within the organization. And there's a ton of different ways to do things. And what's the best way for the organization? And the way that it's been done for years is not necessarily what is best right now. So, yeah, so there's, and again, it's somebody that is new to the organization and can lend a different set of eyes to how the organization is running its
well, and a different set of educated eyes. We've been at this almost an hour now. It's hard to believe. This is good stuff, Steve. And I'm going to do a quick sponsor message, and then we're going to give it to you for a closing thought or a challenge or a tip. What is the thing you want to live? You'll have about 2 minutes for that. And then Russell's really good at summing it up and closing us out. So our sponsor today is ourselves, Center Vision Leadership Foundation. We have this container It's called Community for Community Builders. And it's really a place where nonprofit leaders can work together and learn from each other, can network, can grow their skills. There are forums, there's content, there's videos like this. We have special webinars. Actually, we're doing one in another hour about leadership. The one thing that holds us back is our lack of ability to implement. And so you can join at, well, go to this page, the Nonprofit Exchange, the Nonprofit Exchange, which is the name of this interview.org, the nonprofitexchange.org, and it takes you to the landing page, and you'll see, you'll see whatever's the current interview, but you'll also have a button at the top that says join. If you join right now, we're giving away my free program, The 5 Pillars for Success. And you'll be happy to know, Steve, that one of them is financial. Have an expert on your team that can give you really sage financial advice. So give us a closing tip, and then we'll throw it back to Russell to close us out. And thank you for such rich content today.
Good. Yes, you're quite welcome. I'm very, very happy to be here. The financial side can really be it can be a incredibly positive thing within the organization. It can feed the things that it needs to, and then get out of the way when that needs to happen as well. And my recommendation is that there is an overarching view on the organization from a financial point of view, and that everything is as standardized as possible and as expected as possible. And that you go through, and I most certainly encourage you, if you do one thing, create a budget, because that's going to, at a minimum, you're going to have a huge discussion, a broad discussion about your entire organization and everything that the money touches. So I wish everybody that sees this the absolute best of luck, and I'm very, very happy to be here.
Well, thank you, Steve. It's been a remarkable hour. It's gone by so fast that it's enough to make your head swim. This is a subject near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, maybe not so good, depending on your point of view. Money can really get people stirred up in organizations, but as nonprofit leaders, it's important to be good stewards. The other piece that we do at Center Vision, we talk about having the right people on the bus. And when you're talking about money and handling that, you have to have the right people on the bus. Join the Center Vision community. We have those type of discussions around that with experts who talk about building your nonprofit. And you can join at a number of different levels where you have access to these podcasts, these interviews. You can subscribe to the Nonprofit Exchange on Stitcher or iTunes. And so we'll be back again next week, and join us here again next week on the Nonprofit Exchange, at this time where you'll find another expert in operations who can help you keep your nonprofit on track and grow your mission. Till next week, this is Russell Dennis signing off.